Hello everyone, in this video we're going to talk about review part 8 where we discuss ATP and photosynthesis. We're going to get started first with ATP. The first question asks, what is ATP and what is its role in the cell? So ATP, you can think of it as energy. There are all kinds of energy, right? There's energy from light, there's energy in terms of heat, there's electricity, that's also energy, there's wind that can produce energy, but ATP is a specific type of energy that cells can use directly. It's like little spoon feeding of energy. It works really well, all right? So ATP is very unstable. It can break apart really easily and release its energy into the cell to allow work to be done in the cell. So ATP's role in the cell is to power cell activities or serve as energy. Can glucose be directly used by cells as a source of energy? The answer is no. So the problem with glucose, well, there's not really a problem with it, but in terms of using it directly in the cell, the issue is glucose is a very large molecule, and glucose has a lot of bonds that are very stable. So it's difficult to get glucose used directly by the cell. So we have to kind of break down this large chunk of energy into smaller chunks and that are easier to use, which is ATP. What does ATP stand for? So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Oh my God. Okay, so adenosine triphosphate. This word should make sense to you. You should actually remember the name of ATP. So adenosine is because ATP has this adenine group, and triphosphate because ATP has 3 phosphates. So the 3 parts of an ATP is it has phosphate groups. There are 3 of them. There's a sugar, which is a specific type of sugar called ribose, and there's a nitrogenous base called adenine. So you should remember that there's a phosphate group, a sugar, and a nitrogenous base. Where's the energy stored in the molecule of ATP? So you can think of ATP as squeezing 3 little kindergartners together on one seat. They're too close together. There's too much energy. They don't want to be that close to each other. So what happens is these 3 phosphate groups are the same thing. They don't want to stay together, especially this very last one. There is a lot of energy held between the second phosphate group and the third phosphate group. So the bond in between the second and third phosphate group is where a lot of energy is held and where the breaking down of the third phosphate group will release energy. So the next question is, when you think about, let's do a comparison between ATP and ADP. So if you look right here, ATP has 3 phosphate group, ADP has 2 phosphate group. In order to get ATP transformed into ADP, you need this last phosphate group to fall off, and it really wants to fall off. And when you break this bond, you release a good amount of energy. In comparison, if you're trying to make ATP from ADP, you have to make an extra bond and you're trapping this energy. You're trying to trap this energy. So what you have to do is that you have to add energy and a phosphate group so that this energy can be trapped in the bond between the second and the third phosphate group. How many phosphate groups does ATP and ADP have? So ATP has 3 phosphate groups and ADP has 2 phosphate groups. Which one has more energy? Again, ATP is where you're squeezing all these 3 phosphate groups together. They don't want to be together. So ATP has more energy and is similar to a charged battery. And then ADP is similar to a dead battery where you've used the energy, now everything is calm. When a bond is formed, again, if you're forming a bond, you're trapping energy into that bond. So for our purpose, we're saying the energy is being consumed. And when a bond is broken, then you're releasing the energy. So if you think about glucose, when we learn about cell respiration, we break down glucose into much smaller parts, and as we're breaking down glucose, we're able to release energy from the glucose. Same idea with ATP. When you break ATP apart into ADP and an extra phosphate group, then you release energy. Where is biochemical energy in the form of ATP used? So ATP is used for active transport, for example, right? We all say that active transport is low to high concentration of molecule being moved around and that it needs energy. And the energy that it actually uses is ATP. When would your body produce more ATP? Obviously, when you're exercising, you need more energy, so your body actually has to produce more energy. So your body is producing more ATP when you're exercising. What would happen to a plant if you leave it out of the sunlight for a few days? The plant will survive just fine because plants, its job is to produce a lot of food and it stores away a lot of that food. So And the point of storing away food is so that when the nighttime comes, or if there's not enough sunlight, or during winter there's not a lot of photosynthesis that can go on, then there's still food that they can use. It's almost like you're preparing for an apocalypse. The plants are always preparing for an apocalypse, and it has food, and it'll be just fine after a little while without doing photosynthesis. Moving on, let's talk about the actual photosynthesis part. What makes different colors of lights different? So different colors of light have different amount of energy, and it has different wavelengths. That's what you should know. What role do pigments play in the process of photosynthesis? Pigments absorb energy. So that's the job of any pigment, but specifically for photosynthesis, the most common pigment that is being used is called chlorophyll. So chlorophyll lives in chloroplasts, and its job is to absorb sunlight, and specifically the energy from the sunlight. So if you look at these pictures, A is just a green leaf, B, you're looking at this plant cell, and C, you're zooming in even more, you're looking at one chloroplast. And when you look at the chloroplast, even more zoomed in, then you see this membrane of the chloroplast. Oh no, membrane of the thylakoid. This is a thylakoid membrane. Okay, and these photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 is where the chlorophyll is located. So the thylakoid membrane is full of these chlorophyll, these pigments that can absorb sunlight and absorb this energy and transform it into other forms of energy. All right, moving on. What is the principal pigment in plant? Again, it's called chlorophyll. Don't confuse it with chloroplast. What color does it absorb? So chlorophyll is green, which means it absorbs almost all the colors except for green color. So when you see green color, that's actually green color being reflected from the chlorophyll, and all the other colors are being absorbed. What color does it reflect? It reflects green. Why do most plants will not grow well if it's kept under green light? It's because green light has energy itself, but plants aren't able to harvest that energy because plants mostly use the chlorophyll, and chlorophyll reflects the green light. What would happen to the chlorophyll in the leaves in the fall? So in the fall, it's no longer fall right now, but when we first learned about this concept, it was fall outside, and you could see leaves of different colors. And what happens in the fall is that a lot of the chlorophyll will start breaking down because we're no longer, we're getting ready for the winter. We don't really need chlorophyll anymore, so the chlorophyll breaks down, and other pigment in the plant are shown. For example, carotenoid is a pigment that shows kind of orange-red color, and when chlorophyll break down, the orange-red color is what you're left to see. The next one is different parts of chloroplast. So the chloroplast has an outer membrane and an inner membrane, just like mitochondria. So you really want to make sure that you understand photosynthesis and cell respiration enough, and don't get the two confused, because there are a lot of similarities between the two. So even the organelle that's in charge of photosynthesis, it has two membranes, and it has these disc structures called the thylakoid. If you have a full stack of these thylakoid, you would call it a granum. And then the stroma is the liquid space in between the inner membrane and this thylakoid. So these empty space is the stroma. And then we also have something called the thylakoid lumen, or the lumen of the thylakoid, or the thylakoid space, you can call it. That's the space inside the thylakoid. You should also remember that plants not only do photosynthesis, they also go through cell respiration for every single second of its life. Okay, the reason for that, why are we making food in the first place? Right? We're doing photosynthesis so that we can make food, and when we make that food, plants store it away, and plants do all this work because they want to store that food away so that they can use it. And when plants are using this food, they go through cell respiration as well, just like all of us do. Moving on, when light is absorbed by the pigments in a plant, what happens to the electrons? So in photosynthesis, there are electrons coming from water. So remember, water is the electron supplier, right? Light comes into photosystem 2, electrons get excited, water split, electrons come to photosystem 2. So again, water, as it's supplying the electrons, they're just electrons at ground level, but when lights hit photosystem 2, that energy gets harvested by the chlorophyll living in, or chlorophyll that's a part of the photosystem too, which is also a part of the thylakoid membrane. Then it harvests that energy and use that energy to excite these electrons, and then the electrons will then go on and do work. All right, eventually these electrons are going to be captured by something called NADPH or NADP+. So when NADP+ and the electrons get combined together, so let's write down this equation, so NADP+ and electrons, when those two are combined together, that's when you form something called NADPH. So the difference between NADP+ and NADPH is that NADP+ is an empty wheelbarrow, it's not taking the energy yet, and NADP doesn't have the energy yet. But when NADP+ gets combined with two electrons, it becomes NADPH. So this is a very high energy molecule because it's holding on to these high energy electrons. Moving on. What is the function of NADP+? To be an electron carrier. What is the function of NADPH? Transport electrons that it carries. Which one has higher energy? That will be NADPH because that's the one that already is holding on to the high energy electrons. So when we look at the overview of photosynthesis, we can remember this picture, right? So what you see over here, oh man, this is backward from the one we saw. Hold on, I got the original picture. So the picture that we saw earlier, there's nothing wrong with it, just that the ATP and NADPH directions were backward from where we learned, but it was telling you the same information. Okay, so here's the idea. We have light-dependent reaction where light comes to actually get absorbed. The energy gets absorbed by the thylakoid membrane, specifically the chlorophyll staying on the thylakoid membrane. And then what you see is that water is also the reactant for the process of the light-dependent reaction. And then oxygen, there should be an arrow coming out, oxygen is being released as a part of the light-dependent reaction. However, there are two other products that are made in the light-dependent reaction. There's ADP and NADPH. ATP and NADPH, both are high energy molecules, as you can see with all these stars going around it. So these high energy molecules have the job of taking the energy from the light dependent reaction to the light independent reaction. And what's going on over here is that we have all these individual small CO2 molecules, and the energy is used to combine all of them together so that we can form sugar. Because sugar has a lot more bonds than just CO2, right? C6H12O6, there's a lot of carbons in there, right? So if we want to make sugar, we have to make these bonds, we have to put the CO2 together, and that requires energy. When ATP and NADPH are used, then they can be recycled again. So when ATP drop off its energy, it becomes ADP, and it can go back to the light-dependent reaction and pick up more energy. And then when NADPH drop off its energy at the light-independent reaction, then it can go back, and then the NADP plus can go back to the thylakoid and pick up more high-energy electrons again as well. So moving on, how would photosynthesis be affected if there was a shortage of NADP plus in the cells of plants? So if you think about it, NADP plus gets used over here to pick up the high energy electrons so that those energy can be used to put carbon dioxide together and make sugar. So if you have a shortage of NADP plus, you can't make NADPH, you can't put CO2 together, so you can't make enough sugar. And the plant is going to die. I sound so excited about this. There's nothing exciting about it. All right, the next one is write the equation of photosynthesis. Where is the reactant? Where is the product? So by this point, you're really good at finding the reactants and products. Let's take a look. Here is the chemical reaction for photosynthesis. So anytime you're asked to write a chemical reaction, this is how it should look like. You should have something on the left, something on the right. There should be an arrow in between. So what we have over here, we have carbon dioxide and water as an input for photosynthesis. In order for glucose and oxygen to be formed, you have to have light energy to support this process. Okay, moving on. There's this chart that you can fill out to summarize the process of light-dependent and light-independent reaction. So if you can remember this picture right here without me giving you the answers, right? This picture clearly is not going to be filled out for you on the test. So you need to remember what's going on in here. All right, let's take a look. So the light-dependent reaction, as you can see, takes place in the thylakoid. Go ahead and write that. Light-independent reaction takes place in the stroma. Is light needed? Light-dependent means light is needed, and light-independent means light is not needed directly. What are the reactants? The reactant is water, ADP, and NADP+ for the light-dependent. The products are ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. Okay? You would not say light is a reactant because light is not, it's not a matter. There's no atoms in there. You can't use it to make, you can use the energy to make something, but light is not going to transform into another thing because light is not a tangible thing. If it doesn't make sense, it's fine. All right, moving on. Light-independent reaction, the reactants will be ATP and NADPH to be used as energy, and you have CO2 to be used as a raw material to form the sugar, and the products will be sugar, or you can say glucose, and ADP and NADP+, because those two have to go back to the thylakoid. All right, moving on to the light-dependent and independent reaction, let's take a look at this process right here. This is the light-dependent reaction. Let's go over this process together, right? We have light coming into photosystem 2. Electrons get excited. Water split. So the point of having water is that water is used as an electron supplier for photosystem 2, right? If you keep on exciting electron, take it away. Exciting electron, take it away. Then eventually you're going to be out of electrons. If you're out of electrons, you can't do the next step. So there has to be a constant supplying of electrons, which is where H2O comes from. And oxygen is released as a byproduct, we say, because we're not trying to make oxygen. Plants making oxygen is only a happy accident for all of us, but plants are not trying to make oxygen. It's just an accident. It's made because as it's splitting the water, the O2 is being released. So what's happening next is that these electrons will get carried through the electron transport chain from one protein to the next, to the next, to the next. So what you see here, the electron jump to here, jump to here, jump to here, jump to here. But as these electrons are moving down the electron transport chain, excuse me, as these electrons are moving down the electron transport chain, it pumps hydrogen from the stroma to the thylakoid space. So what's going on over here is that electrons, as they move down, it's going to lose some of this energy. Like see my hand movement, it's going to lose some energy. But when this energy is being lost, that energy gets used to move hydrogen from an area of low concentration of hydrogen ions to an area that already has a high concentration of hydrogen ion. So we're trying to build this high concentration in the thylakoid space, just like we did for cell respiration in the intermembrane space. Okay, so the next thing that happens is that these electrons, by the time they get to photosystem 1, they've already lost a lot of the energy, so we have to re-energize the electrons. So electrons move down the electron transport chain and pump hydrogen from the low concentration to high concentration from stroma to the thylakoid space. And then light comes into photosystem 1, electrons get re-energized, and then they move down a short electron transport chain and combine with NADP+ to form NADPH. So what's going on over here is that NADP+ serves not only as an electron carrier, but also a final electron acceptor. NADP+ is grabbing electrons away from the electron transport chain, right, and combining it to form NADPH. So it's actively removing the electrons so that all the electrons can go all the way through the electron transport chain, right? It's as if, let's say you have a row of people. These people, that they can't move unless you pull them. You pull one person, that everybody's going to follow, right? Because they're all holding hands. So when you drag one person, everybody's going to get dragged over. That's kind of how it works. This NADP+ drags the entire row of electrons, this entire chain of electrons, through the electron transport chain. And then we form NADPH, which will then move on to the light-independent reaction and serve as an energy source for the making of glucose. And then we have this ATP synthase, which spins around. So ATP synthase allows hydrogen ions to travel from a high concentration to a low concentration. And hydrogen ions want to do that. As soon as this door is open, hydrogen ions will flow through from high to low because diffusion is going to happen whether you want it or not. So once this channel is open, these hydrogen ions will move through the ATP synthase and allow the ATP synthase to spin. So if you were to ask, again, what powers the ATP synthase, it will be the hydrogen ion, just like it is in cell respiration. And as the ATP synthase is spinning, it's going to form ADP. Lastly, we have this picture right here to show you what's going on in the light-independent reaction. So both ATP and NADPH, after it's made, they go into the light-independent reaction. When oxygen is made, it just comes right out of the leaves. So what's going on over here is that we have CO2 coming into the stroma of the chloroplast. And when these CO2 come in, we kind of slam them together, reshuffle some carbons, and then in the end, we make sugar. So this sugar right here is called G3P. It has 3 carbons, but if you have 3 carbons and then you have another 3 carbons, 2 G3P together, you will make 1 glucose. So 1 glucose has 6 carbons. If you're trying to make 6 carbons, then you need 6 carbon dioxide. So what you see right here, 6 carbon dioxide, 2 G3P, which also is equivalent to 1 glucose. And as you see over here, this process, this entire Kelvin cycle, remember this one is called the Kelvin cycle, and the Krebs cycle is the one for cell respiration. So don't get the two confused, okay? This Kelvin cycle is able to be powered because of the ATP and the NADPH. NADPH has high energy electrons that gets used to produce energy, and the ATP has energy itself, and it gets used as well. So actually, both photosynthesis and cell respiration produces ATP during the process. It's just that as soon as ATP is made in photosynthesis, it gets used. Now, let's take a look at these questions. Hopefully, the bell's about to ring. All right, so which reaction uses water? The light independent reaction uses water. No, what did I just say? No. When the light-dependent reaction uses water. Why is water needed? Electron supplier. Why is light needed? Used as energy to excite the electrons. Which reaction uses carbon dioxide? That will be light-independent reaction. Why is carbon dioxide needed? It's used to form glucose, because glucose has carbon in it as well. Which reaction produces oxygen? That will be light-dependent. Produces sugar, light-independent. Produces ATP and NADPH, light-dependent. What happens to them? Once they're produced, they go to the light-independent reaction to power the production of glucose from CO2. Where in the chloroplast is chlorophyll located? The thylakoid membrane. Where is hydrogen pumped from and to? From the stroma to the thylakoid space. Next one, what concentration to what concentration? It's pumped from low to high as the electrons are moving through the electron transport chain, because that energy gets used to pump the hydrogen, low to high. Low to high, okay? Where does the energy used to pump hydrogen come from? From the high energy electrons that were excited by light. What happens to the energy level of the electrons? They lose energy. During the light-dependent reaction, what combines with the electrons? In the end, NADP plus combines with the electrons. What molecules in thylakoid is in charge of the synthesis? ATP synthase. ATP synthesis is an energy absorbing. Where does that energy come from during the light-dependent reaction? That energy directly comes from the difference in concentration of hydrogen. Main product of Kelvin cycle, glucose. How many molecules are needed for 1 glucose? 6 carbons. What happens to these? They go back to the light-dependent reaction. 3 carbon compound are going to combine to form glucose and other macromolecules. Enzymes speed up chemical reactions. 3 primary factors. Light, water, and CO2 level. No, light, water, temperature.